Welcome to everyone. I'm glad you're attending. Many of you I know are first-time attenders at the Gonzaga Socratic Club, and many of you are from far-flung places. I'm very happy to welcome you. Glad that you're here to join us. Let me just say a word about the Gonzaga Socratic Club. It's an organization on the Gonzaga University campus, Spokane, Washington. Been meeting for about 16 years now during the academic year. And we take our inspiration and name from the Oxford Socratic Club that was directed by C.S. Lewis in the mid-1900s. His principle was to follow the argument wherever it leads, especially concerning matters of Christian worldview. And so those are the topics that we tend to address in the Socratic Club, things like Christianity and modern culture, Christianity and education, Christology, theology, philosophical theology, and so forth. And we've had an interesting slate of people present over the years, and I'm especially happy that one fortuitous effect of COVID is that I'm able to gather together folks from far-flung places. I'm especially happy to welcome our speaker today. David Wang is Professor Emeritus of Architecture at Washington State University, the author of several books on architecture, and most recently the book Architecture and Sacrament, A Critical Theory, that was published by Routledge just last year. Indeed, David was initially scheduled to present at the Socratic Club right after publication of his book last year, and COVID intervened. So I'm glad that we're able to pick up the schedule and make it happen this year. I sometimes offer some introductory remarks, but I think I'll just turn it over to Dr. Wang and let him proceed. And let's just get into the conversation here. So he'll have a presentation. Let me say a word about our format. Dr. Wang will offer a presentation about sacrament in everyday places. And we often have a comment response at the Socratic Club. Our comment response today is going to be offered by Professor Philip Vest of University of Notre Dame, who will give us some things to think about, and then we'll have time for questions and comments and discussion thereafter. So David Wang, I'll turn it over to you then.
Thank you very much, David. And let me do this share screen technology here. All right, could everybody see my pretty picture there?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Calhoun, Professor of Philosophy at Gonzaga. Thank you to the Socratic Club at Gonzaga. And I want to...
I'm fine. Yeah, aren't you nice? I'm trying to listen to a Zoom meeting. It's a professor friend of mine who's giving a lecture, and I wanted to hear him on the way home. Yeah, thank you.
Everybody's here. Okay, so if you're listening, please put your speaker on mute. I'm particularly happy and honored to have Professor Philip Bess as giving the response to my talk this evening. I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say. As David Calhoun mentioned, just a little bit more about me. Most of my published work at Washington State University has to do with design research. This book came out in 2013. It's a second edition of the original book that came out in 2002. So we've been looking at this topic for quite some time. And as a matter of fact, this last COVID year, the other book that came out is another research methods book for design. And I continue to work in this area of textbooks for designers. In fact, I'm working on one right now with one of my co-authors in attendance. But over the years at Washington State, I also taught a course offered jointly by the architecture program and the philosophy program, having to do with Chinese philosophy and its impact on Asian architecture, and comparing that with ideas in the Latin West and their impact on architecture. And this book came out about 5 years ago. And increasingly, as I taught these topics, what attracted me was the interest to look at ancient ideas and how those ideas impact current issues in architectural theory and design, environmental theory. By ancient, I mean prior to the Enlightenment centuries, the 17th and 18th century, and certainly prior to the Industrial Revolution. And what I'm finding out both East and West is that these long-standing ideas are profound. They offer us new ways to see to think about our built environments today. And so I continue to work in this area. And that's the reason why this book came out also last year. And I look back all the way to the classical period, ideas of the early Christian thinkers, all the way through Aquinas. And I'll be addressing that more as we go. It is, in fact, this book that brings us together tonight. And so I want to talk about sacrament in everyday places. By sacrament in everyday places, I mean, for example, trying to get my technology to work here. For example, a cafe nook, where large swaths of this book was written, or something like a little alleyway. This is a neighborhood in Beijing, a Hutong neighborhood, which I ventured into. You go through this little gate and you ventured into, and I was taking pictures, and this man comes out of one of these humble dwellings, and he says to me, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm taking some pictures." And he says, "But this is my home." So humble places could mean tremendous, hold deep meaning. And I'd like to unpack how that works this evening. So cafe nooks, humble alleyways, even traffic jams. And my concluding remark in this presentation tonight will be how even traffic jams can work as sacrament in everyday places. Trust me, traffic jams are architecture because of what we do to our environment, how we get around. Sacrament in everyday places, we have to address, how is that possible sitting in the traffic? Everyday places anchor our sense of belonging in the world. We could travel far to the Great Wall or the Eiffel Tower or the Taj Mahal and other pieces of iconic architecture and have a lot of interest in seeing those things. But those places do not anchor us. It's the everyday places that we surround ourselves with and we are in that give us a sense of place and a sense of belonging, or they don't. The challenge of the contemporary world is that we have a lot of environments that actually are very difficult to experience a sense of belonging and sacramentality. This is the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. In his magnum opus, The Secular Age, he says this about architecture: the shape of the city no longer manifests a single overarching meaning. On the one hand, individual great buildings, each monumentalize some corporation or triumphant entrepreneur, while on the other, vast areas of the city form a crazy quilt of special purpose constructions, factories, malls, docks, each following some fragmentary instrumental rationality. And this is the built environment that we largely confront today. Let me show you an etching from 1525. This is Elbricht Buer, Artist and Nude. And this was done in the right about the time when ideas began to shift from, shall we say, ideas of the great tradition over towards more of a scientific Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment view. What we have here is the subject matter on the left. We have the artist doing his job on the right, and look how uptight he is and nervous he is. He has one chance to get this right. And the chance to get this right is to follow the coordinates of the grid. If the grid, if he doesn't obey the grid, then the representation is incorrect. Never mind that there is a physical presence on the other side of the screen. What he captures in terms of the representation, there's no guarantee that the presence comes with it. And this is a further abstraction. The green bubble is the cosmos. And this Cartesian way of looking at things, we are removed from the cosmos. This is your eye, my eye, the human eye, is removed from the cosmos. And I would say one big issue in philosophy since the Enlightenment times is embedded in all of that is if the whole cosmos is over here, what the heck is over here? And this is a question that all kinds of philosophical systems try to answer since the Enlightenment. But in fact, what we have here is the almighty grid, right? So this is an abstraction of ideas during the great tradition previous to the Enlightenment and what we have today in terms of the scientific point of view. It's very interesting that it was at this time that within the church, there came to be a debate about the Eucharist. Are these elements signs of a presence that is here, which is had for centuries, this was the unreflected view prior to the this period of time, prior to the early 16th century? Or are these signs of a presence that is not here? You see this this inclination largely reflects a theological view of this position. I mean, we have the elements, but we have the screen, the grid of doctrine to tell us what these elements are about. And they merely represent a presence that I don't have on this side. Large swaths, not all, but large swaths of the Protestant wing of the church, this is how the Protestant wing largely views this. And in my view, it is thanks to the ideas that come out of the Enlightenment period. I want to give you an example of sacrament in an everyday place. This is simply a picture of a cafeteria. And I want to read you a short poem written by the famous award-winning poet Czesław Miłosz. Here's the poem. My parents, my husband, my brother, my sister. I'm listening in a cafeteria at breakfast. The women's voices rustle, fulfill themselves in a ritual no doubt necessary. I glance sidelong at their moving lips, and I delight in being here on earth for one more moment with them here on earth to celebrate our tiny, tiny minus. I like to suggest this is a moment of sacrament in an everyday place. This moment consists of three threads. First, you need the physical archetype. I mean, you need the physicality. Sacrament always entails a physical token. If the physicality is not there, it could be something in your imagination or something you had for lunch or whatever. But or a dream, but for sacramental experience, you need the physical token. And this happens to be an everyday cafeteria. So that's one thread. The other thread is you need the internal architecture of the I, or the me, or the minus. And I have much more to say about the arrangements of the internal orderliness of you and me as we are enmeshed in these everyday places. The third element is an enormous larger order. And here the poet describes it as simply the earth, in relation to which I am very, very tiny. I'm very tiny in relation to this earth. When these three elements combine and intertwine, there's the possibility of sacrament in everyday places. And here's a definition of it then. The architecture in front of me rhymes with a moral orderliness within me, which in turn rhymes with an orderliness of the cosmos around me. When these three threads align, we have the possibility of sacrament and architecture. Now, to show this graphically, once again, you have the object in front of me. You have the moral orderliness within me. And you have the enormous orderliness of the cosmos around me. When these three threads align, there's a way that this grid disappears, and you participate in a moment which our poet describes as delight and celebration of my smallness, of my tininess in this large order of things. I characterize this perhaps as home. I mean, there are many people for whom physical house that they live in is not home. So I'm not limiting this to sort of residences. But in architectural theory, there's very much theory being generated now about what is dwelling, what is being at home. And I suggest that this way that I'm explaining it is one way that we can explain how to be at homeness. Today's theory, design theory, majors on the first of these three elements, physical architecture. If you get the arrangements of the physical characteristics of your architecture correctly, then you're just going to feel at home. You're going to feel identity, you're going to feel belonging. It's an emphasis, overemphasis, I think, on just the physical form. And with the advent of computational design and 3D printing, more and more what we focus on is just the physical configuration of things. And this is just 1/3 of our framework for architecture and sacrament. This is Seaside, Florida. It subscribes to a town planning movement called New Urbanism, which began to be active in the last quarter of the 20th century and continues to appeal today. If you design your town with elements of mixed use, in other words, your house is walkable to the barber shop, to the bakery, to the library, to the theater, and a de-emphasis on the automobile because you can walk to all these places. The literature in this domain just says you will feel a sense of community. We don't have time for me to actually give you cite examples of this, but this is the view of the new urbanist design community, that if you just get your physical forms right, you will feel a sense of belonging. And my colleague, Professor Bess, for much of that I've known of him, has written on the pros and cons of new urbanism, and I'm hoping he'll say something about it a little bit later. But this is Seaside, Florida, a new urbanist community. It is also the place where the Truman Show was filmed. True Man, okay? I mean, this is, I think this is one of the most profound movies I have ever seen. And my kids got me to watch it. You know, when this is years ago, my kids were young and, Dad, you've got to watch this. I mean, I don't want to. Yeah, you have to. So when I started watching it, it began to dawn on me, this is one of the most profound statements I have ever seen. The point is, Truman thinks that he's living a real life. He's the only one that doesn't realize everybody else in his life are actors. And he is actually part of a reality TV show. My point to you is that this was filmed in Seaside, and they didn't need to have many props because the whole thing is a stage set. It's an arrangement of physical props. And when Truman finds out about this, he seeks to escape his stage set world. So my contention is that when we only look at the physical attributes of buildings, we're missing out on a lot of historic material that looked at our moral interior and also the orderliness of the cosmos. All of this provided by ideas prior to the Enlightenment. I want to spend the next few slides giving an overview of the theoretical and theological framework within which I worked in the book. This framework informs all 7 chapters, but necessarily for this presentation, I'm just going to give this a flyover because if we get into the weeds on this, it'll be a different presentation altogether. I just want to give a flyover of the theological structure with which I worked, and then immediately segue to my concluding 5 applications for how we cultivate sacrament in everyday places. I'm hugely indebted to this book by the Polish-German Jesuit theologian Zivarva. And he retrieved a long-standing line of thought called analogy of being, analogia entis, that comes down through Aristotle, all the way through Thomas Aquinas and into the medieval centuries. Sort of fell out of circulation after the Enlightenment. And in the 20th century, Zivarva recovered this, retrieved this. And I think this book is one of the most significant publications of the 20th century, highly underestimated and not circulated because for one reason, the guy is utterly incomprehensible. I mean, you have to, you really have to delve into this and read each. I always tell my graduate students when I give them an assignment, if you read this assigned reading 3 times carefully, you still don't understand it, it's probably not your fault. Because some of these writings are so esoteric. That doesn't apply to Zivarva. I mean, it has helped me think through the issues of this book tremendously. What does he say? Zivarva holds that everything in the cosmos, the beings of everything in the cosmos is contingent. I as a being is contingent. You as a human being is contingent. We don't know what tomorrow will bring. We regret what happened yesterday. I mean, there's no sort of settledness in our being, and our very being is dependent on fundamental being. This applies not only for human beings, it applies to trees, nature, stones, rocks, the computer I'm looking at right now. Anything that has being is contingent on fundamental being. And the relationship between us as beings and fundamental being is an analogical one. How does this work and how does this inform sacrament in everyday places? Well, this is my diagram, but there's much of Zivarva in here. What he holds is that he returns to the Logos. Many of you in this audience would know that the Logos in classical ideas is the fundamental reason of the cosmos. The cosmos is imbued with a fundamental reason. And this thing goes all the way back to Heraclitus, 5th, 6th century BCE, the pre-Socratic. It's not clear exactly what Heraclitus meant by Logos at that point in time. It's not clear what Heraclitus meant by anything, but certainly by the time of Plato and Aristotle, and by the time of the Stoic philosophers, Logos became the fundamental reason, the soul. I mean, the Stoics held that Logos was the soul, the heartbeat of the cosmos. And when the Hellenistic world transitioned into the Christian world, this, of course, became the incarnated God, the beginning of the fourth gospel. In the beginning was Logos. The Logos was with God. The Logos was God. And several passages later in that same chapter, John says, this Logos tabernacled with human beings. So there's a way that in the Christian understanding of Logos, it is the incarnated God that permeates the entire cosmos. And in response, little human beings, you can hardly see them, which is apropos, respond in language back to this Logos. And this model is pertinent not just to people in the church. I mean, this is all humanity, and all being in the cosmos respond to the incarnated cosmos. And so you have Paul in the New Testament saying that all things are from him, through him, and to him. It is a coverage of the entire cosmos. That's the vertical connection, that the vertical analogy that Svarva addresses, the analogy between word as Logos and us as small words. We stand in analogical relationship, one to the other. On the horizontal axis is the entire creaturely experience. I just said, I mean, I don't know what tomorrow will bring. I don't remember half of what happened yesterday. We are contingent beings, and this is we are in a cosmos that is constantly in flux, constantly at change. And in that respect, this model is not any much different from the post-structuralist model that I'll show you in a bit. The only difference is that it has a transcendental anchor. And in this respect, words are not arbitrary. The deconstructionists spill many words to tell you that words don't mean anything. I mean, words fundamentally mean something because it is analogically anchored to a word, that transcendent word that never changes, even though it is permeated throughout the cosmos. And so Svarva, for instance, calls our cosmos an incarnation cosmos. But this is the reason why this cosmos that we are in is an analogical cosmos. And analogy fills everything in our view. And in my book, I call this the sacramental zone. The entire cosmos is a sacramental zone because in every nook and cranny of the cosmos, you have your three elements. You have materiality, you have the orderliness within you, and you have a vast orderliness around you. So you have the ingredients for experiencing belonging in everyday places. The human being that I put in the circle, this of course is the Vitruvian man. It dates to the first theorist that has come down to us in the West, Vitruvius, who lived in 1st century BCE. Prior to the Christian era, there was already in the classical culture, classical ideas, the notion that the entire cosmos is humane, and that human proportions, ideal human proportions, is distributed throughout the cosmos. And so buildings, physical buildings then, must be in proportion to this larger humanity. Proportion is analogia. And so in classical architecture, we have human proportions in response to the proportions of the cosmos. Now, by the time of the, so you have the medieval commentators saying this: the human figure interpreted as a mirror of the cosmos, for in like manner, the firmament has its length equal to its breadth. So by the time of the Renaissance, you have cathedrals who are themselves analogies of the cosmos. In other words, the basilica, the cathedral, the temple, was always thought analogically as an analogy of the cosmos. Why did they think that way? Because they were thinking analogically. This is prior to the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. So you have the Vitruvian Man now as the incarnated Christos filling the entire cosmos. And many of these drawings abound in the architecture of the Renaissance. So when you look at a building like this is the Maison Carrée in southern France. When a denizen of that world was presented with this object in front of him or her, it's not that there was there was a screen. It's not that it's an object separate from me. This orderliness embraces the participant, because the order, it cultivates an orderliness in me, and I in turn rhyme with the orderliness of this object, which in turn rhymes with the orderliness of the cosmos. It's a way of looking at things that, frankly, we have lost in our age. But I say in the book that it doesn't have to be just classical architecture. Any architecture that brings us to a transcendent order has the power to usher in what amounts to a sacramental sense of belonging. Here's a family that is remembering a lost one at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which in my view is one of the most powerful pieces of architecture in the 20th century. This is what the architect said about her design, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Let's see if I can. It is an interface between our world and the quieter, darker, more peaceful world beyond. I never looked at the memorial as a wall, an object, but as an edge to the earth, an open side. The mirrored effect creates two worlds, one we are a part of and one we cannot enter. And so this is Maya Lin, and I suggested this in the book as an example of contemporary architecture offering a sacramental presence. This next picture, the Asian practice of taking one's shoes off as one crosses a threshold, I say has the lineaments of sacrament in everyday places. I humble myself by taking off my shoes, crossing the threshold into another world, and I'm informed. My humility is informed by a larger orderliness that I have cultivated. What does the other anthropology look like? The structuralist, post-structuralist view of human being begins with its claim that words are arbitrary. Words are completely arbitrary. We can define them any way we want because they do not have a possibility of representing originals. In fact, there is no original to represent. So how do these arbitrary words take on meaning? Well, they take on meaning when institutional powers, which themselves are in ceaseless conflict, enforce those meanings. Political structures. And don't tell me you haven't noticed that in this last year. Entertainment industry, educational monopolies, even holidays. According to this scheme, this regime, holidays are imposed upon you by a privileged order of things. And it is something that the genuine person, the authentic person, ought to resist. Capitalism is certainly to be resisted as an oppressive institution. Structuralism and post-structuralism, as many of you know, came out of the post-structuralism. The structuralism was earlier, came out of the disillusionment that many Marxist thinkers had, how the First World War didn't turn out the way they had expected. And you have thinkers, I'm thinking of the Frankfurt School, who tried to adapt Marxism into a post-Marxist sort of view of a critique of culture. I addressed that in chapter 3 of my book. But certainly, and certainly the big bad boy is capitalism. And I don't have any stock in capitalism myself. In fact, in my book on Chinese architecture, I talk about how capitalism made an entire nation, entire nation of Chinese citizens drug addicts, because the British Empire wanted to balance trade and enforce the shipment of opium upon the Chinese people. I mean, this is capitalism at work. So I don't have any love for capital. I certainly see the limitations of this economic system. Advertising, Fox News versus CNN, white interpretations of history. I mean, we're in the midst of this right now. The interesting thing that this has developed into is that you now are an intersection of these endless prejudices. It's not only society that is a conflation of all of these institutional powers at odds with each other. You yourself are an intersection of these ideas, and you never are more than a hodgepodge. Now, look, I said I will address this in broad brush ways. I might have some pushback on this, which is fine, but clearly my message is that the chapters of my book are based upon this framework on the left. What does a post-structuralist anthropology look like in terms of architecture? Well, it might look like this. I mean, this is the Libeskind Jewish Museum in Berlin. And obviously I selected this work because it bears, whoops. It bears graphic similarity to my diagram here. But look, I want to just say something very clear here. I am a contemporary trained architect, an architectural theorist. With that framework, I like this building. I've been there several times. It is a powerful, powerful, powerful building. I've introduced it to my students many times. What I am doing in the book, however, is to look at the philosophical underlayment behind these structures. And my contention for a post-structuralist view of humanity, that all architecture can do is represent presences that are not here. You can represent the horror of the Holocaust. And again, I want to honor all the lives that were lost in this unbelievable conflagration. But it is a representation of horror. Just as this is a representation of a New England town. We don't get beyond representation within which we have to situate ourselves. And I see that as a limitation, which goes back to, is the presence here, or is the presence not here, and it's only being represented by material objects? Again, this is a broad overview of the theoretical framework. We can have discussion on this and certainly read my book. But I want to segue now immediately to the my conclusion, which is 5 ways we can cultivate sacrament in everyday places, and requires cultivation. One is to submit to practices which have a history. The philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, in his After Virtue, and a colleague of Philip Best's at Notre Dame, he says that virtues are formed by participating in long established practices, impacting the well-being of a community. He uses examples like chess. I mean, you just can't start playing chess and win every game. You have to learn the rules. Football, the games in ancient Greece, the physical body of the athlete back then was considered a virtue because he, I think it was always a he, submitted to the discipline and training of the long tradition of the games. Bringing something worthwhile into fruition requires submission to the processes involved, even as the emerging orderliness analogizes to the orderliness of production in the cosmos. And so I gave this example in my book where this cafe nook became meaningful to me. I mean, look, I have a nice home. As an architect, I designed a studio next to my house, but I have to drive halfway across town to this nook before I can feel at home to write. I mean, it's true confessions, but here's the point. In this process, over time, the place where this occurs takes on sacramental overtones. So what I mean by history is not only to submit to historical practices with centuries of tradition, I also mean the practices that you undergo as you bring something to fruition. If you submit to that practice, the places where you submit to that practice could take on sacramental overtones. Submit to practices which have a history. Cultivate glow. And I just offer a short abbreviated version of what I mean, definition of what I mean, holistic immersion in which both you and your environment participate as one in divine presence. I asked the question, why did painters prior to the early Renaissance, I mean, you're talking 1200 years since the beginning of the Christian era, why did painters for those 1200 years never paint in perspective? I mean, what were they seeing? Here's just, I just got this, this is a non-religious topic. Here's the murder of Thomas Becket. But it's not in mathematical perspective. I mean, what's wrong with those people? Well, I mean, they remember they did not have the perspectival grid. The purpose of architecture and art was to bring you into the web of that situation unadulterated. And a perspective is not, it's not just one view, it's you inside that world. And I traced the loss of glow from the immersive light in Plato and Aristotle, which gave us glow, to the emanation of light in Plotinus and the Pseudo-Dionysius, which gave us glow, to scientific light, which all of a sudden we discover that light is just waves and particles. And with this discovery of light, there is a sense in which presence was lost because light became mathematicized. And then the light of romanticism, I submit that the mystery, the celebration of mystery and romanticism is really trying to replicate the loss of enchantment of the earlier centuries. And then artificial lighting, of course, we can mark human history before and after artificial lighting. This is a profound development. We don't give a hoot today what we do when we do it. We don't give a hoot about natural lighting because we can do whatever we want, wherever we want, whenever we want, because we have artificial lighting. I ask in the book, if you are to design a building totally dependent on natural light, what would that look like in plan, section, and elevation? I mean, this is the way buildings were designed for centuries before the Enlightenment period, before the Industrial Revolution, what would it look like? And what would life in such a building look like? This is a space filled with light. This happens to be my home that I'm privileged to live in. This home was designed by the Spokane architect Ken Brooks in 1979. There's marvelous rhythms of light here. And I mean, trust me, we have lights, we have artificial lights, but you can go through a whole day without any lighting here and just appreciate the patterns of the natural light as it goes through here. What would a building look like totally dependent on natural light? It would be a good design exercise. And if you're not a designer, if you're not an architect, then you won't have opportunity to design buildings. Consider this. Schedule a day without artificial lighting. What would that day look like, and how would that impinge on your activities and your plans? Schedule several days without artificial lighting. Schedule it regularly. What rhythms of life would emerge in that type of cultivated lifestyle? And I submit that those rhythms will embrace physical environments that begin to have the glow of sacrament in everyday places. Recover procession and arrival. And I say in the book, in the face of the overwhelming anonymity of our built environments today, as per Charles Taylor we heard earlier, the beginning of architecture and sacrament entails recovering the physical center from which actions meaningfully radiate as actions of being, and to which resolves issues of identity and place. For the first time, we live in a world in which getting there is purely thought of as something we put up with as we move through hours of anonymous space. And when we get there, there's no there. I like to show this floor plan. I mean, just imagine if your office was this one here. This is an office building. Imagine this is your office right here. You just took the L, I mean, I'm thinking Chicago, but you just took the L, the bus, walking through winter weather, hour and a half, you just came to this, and this is your office that you will be in for 10 hours, 5 days a week. I mean, you might as well die now. I mean, there's no arrival there. And this is the grief of the kind of architecture that we habitually deal with. In the book, I show the procession in Rome to this little spot. This is the Pantheon. And I talk about the wonder of the procession that it takes to get here as part of the experience before you actually arrive. Now, this is not an everyday place, granted, but I leave you with this question. What everyday place is center for you? And in writing this book, I've had to confront this myself. Don't just say house, my house. What everyday place in detail is a center for you from which your actions meaningfully radiate out and to which your issues of identity resolve? We live in a time where this question is difficult to answer, and I present it to you as a possibility to consider for a sacrament in everyday places. And then how do you design the procession for arriving at such a place? The old is often better. Retain it as you move forward. This is a children's library in another Hutong neighborhood. This is by a fairly well-known architect, Chinese architect, Ma Yansong. The Asians are much better in embracing the past even as they move forward to the new. There's a wonderful way in which they retain old materials, and I can show you many, many examples if we had more time. To embrace the old, because the old has ingrained in it or inscribed in it our past. And if we get rid of the old, we get rid of ourselves. So I ask, in lieu of cancel culture, how do we incorporate artifacts from the past into new material expressions of values moving forward? How do we incorporate these? Because if you get rid of these things, it doesn't get rid of the marks that they have made on you. You might as well embrace them and find design solutions that incorporate them into material expressions of values. And why is that important? Because I say that every movement from A to B analogizes the journey from Pastoral Paradise to New Jerusalem. And for those of you who are Bible readers, you know that the Bible begins with a pastoral paradise, and it ends in New Jerusalem. And in chapter 4 of my book, I talk about all of human history as a journey from A to B. And therefore, every movement from A to B analogizes to this universal movement from Pastoral Paradise to New Jerusalem. I say in the book that as we go and see iconic places, an often unaddressed feeling that we get is once we arrive there, we say, oh, there it is. And it doesn't fulfill our total identity. And why is that? Because iconic objects point backwards in time. It's where we came from. Sacrament happens moving forward in time because it embraces us in participation. And so, in a forward direction, the telos within analogy of being gives hope that the frustration of sitting in a traffic jam is not a final condition, nor an isolated condition, but part of a larger coherent journey. So the aesthetics of a traffic jam is firstly internal. It cultivates moral patience of the one sitting there, going nowhere at this point in time, but headed somewhere in the larger orb of time. Thank you. If you, just a little bit of promotion, this book is available at routledge.com. If you put in this code, I think you get 25% off. Just to assure you of all the published books I've published, I can, with those royalties, I can probably take you and me out to a nice dinner. Okay, so it's not about money. Maybe several nice dinners. Okay. Okay. And now I'm looking forward to hearing what my colleague Philip Bess has to say in response. And speaking of New Jerusalem, his book "Till We Have Built Jerusalem" years ago was the first book that I read as a Christian architect teaching in a secular environment. I came across this book and I said, "No, what's this about?" And I have high respect for what Professor Bess has to say, and I'm happy that he can provide a response now.
Thank you very much, David, and David Calhoun as well. Thank you, David Wang and David Calhoun, for the invitation to be here this evening. Thank you, David Wang, for your presentation and your kind words, and for your book. And I have been I've been a big fan of this book before it was even a book. I was invited about 2.5 years ago, maybe a little longer, to review it, review it as a book proposal. I was one of those anonymous readers. And I remember getting it, and I always, as is my way, I put things off till the end. So the deadline was coming up, and I hadn't responded. And I was actually on a plane from Chicago to Seattle on my way to the 2017 convention of the Congress, meeting of the Congress for the New Urbanism. And I was reading the chapter of the book, and just being kind of blown away. And there were several things that they sent. I mean, I think there was a biography and a little brief on the book, and I kind of read these with a little bit of a sort of jaundiced, skeptical eye, because I was educated. My architectural education came from convinced Corbusians. And so it just created me a kind of suspicion. Because I remember that the first book that they had me read, or the first essay they had me read, was a chapter from Mircea Eliade's The Sacred and the Profane. which I was enthusiastic about actually about reading it, but then they never wanted to talk about it. And I realized it was just, even though I later figured out, kind of what they were getting at, but I never quite took it seriously. And I kind of came to the book, with that little bit of, of suspicion, not knowing David, and then I started reading the draft introduction, and I was just blown away. The editor at Routledge said that my response for the book was unlike anything she had ever read. So since it was published, I guess I'll take it. I'll take that as a good sign. But anyway, I'm very pleased that the book is out, and pleased to have become friends with David over, in the intervening years. We've corresponded, although this is the first time we've seen each other face to face. So again, it's a great pleasure to be here. I really, so I'm doing something that I never do before, or not that I've never done it before, but I rarely do, which is not come with prepared remarks, because it's a kind of a self-protection theme. But I feel like I'm here among friends, right? So I can talk from notes. And so, here they are. It's like Amy Barrett, I'm not, with respect to following her ability to follow questions and arguments, and my lack thereof. But so if I apologize in advance if it's a little inchoate, but I guess I want to start with a comment about driving, right? Again, sort of when I first read this from David, okay, I want to see what David has to say about this. And David, actually, you've convinced me, right? I mean, this is a kind of as a sort of a metaphor, as a sensibility that one can attain to sort of understand being stuck in a traffic jam as being in some way analogous to our pilgrimage through life. That actually makes a certain kind of sense to me, and it requires it requires a certain perspective on things to be able to see it properly, I think, in the way that you described. But it does remind me of a little family experience. I try not to drive angry, but I have driven angry in the past in the presence of my children. And so there's a little family story, right, which is the pondering, how would Jesus drive, right? And the answer to that is, Dad drives like Jesus drives the money changers out of the temple. So anyway, so that resonated with me a little bit, and I'm trying to be better. I want to, if I can do this succinctly, I want to talk about, I guess there are sort of three areas where I'd like to, take up David's challenge and make some comments and also sort of ask him some questions about this. And they have to do, I would say, broadly with theology, with anthropology, and with education. And I want to say, I think most positively, or I don't want to say positive, most gratefully, with respect to theology, David's book really helped for me to clarify intuitions that I'd had for a long time, things that I'd been thinking for a long time, that were kind of intuitions, right, about the sacramental character of life, which is something that being raised a Baptist was not. It was not part of my spiritual furniture. There was much that I was given, as much furniture I was given, but sacramentality was not part of it. And eventually, when I became a Catholic, it wasn't primarily for the sacramental sensibility, but for other reasons. And of course, over time, if when you participate regularly in the sacraments, they begin to shape you. And it kind of goes back in a way to the educational question that I have a little bit later. But David, particularly, I think in the book where he's writing about sacramentality as cosmic participation, and he actually identified the etymology of the word and what its secular origins and how it was adopted by the church fathers. And it was really a kind of light bulb moment for me. That helped articulate this intuition about sacramentality and participation, because in addition to that, I think that the idea of sacramentality is a really wonderful bridge between the idea of God as totally other, right, as transcendent, who creates the world, out of love, and the world is not God, right? That there is God and there is the world, and sacramentality is the bridge that sort of explains our experiences of God in the world, in material things, and so I'm very grateful actually to David for articulating that in the way that he's done. Which I have to say also, this is my reaction when I read the book, and that I was enthusiastic about it. I was astonished by it, just where it came from, and I just thought it was a very brave thing to write, out of academia in a secular university. And so that's another thing that I really do appreciate about the book, about David's book, because it really does challenge critical theory, right? I mean, what's the old joke, question authority, right? Says who? And so I really admire that aspect of David's book as well. With respect to the anthropological issues, I guess I have a little bit different, maybe not, but I might have a little bit different angle on that, because I'm not unsympathetic to Dürer learning to draw perspective through the grid, because I take it, in fact, I actually see it as a different way, or another way of responding to the logos, right? That it really, and I think that it has to do with my sense of human nature being that we can't help but abstract. We can't help but categorize. It's what we do. It's because our knowledge is inherently imperfect, but what knowledge we have of the world comes from the kinds of categories that we create that allow us to understand some aspect of it. And if the categories are useful, arbitrary as they are, they're useful because they give us some at least partial degree of insight into the nature of truth. And so I'm imagining Dürer, with a kind of desire to know something a little bit better. And the problem, of course, is if you take that abstraction as being the reality itself, if it becomes divorced from this larger perspective. It's one of the reasons why I'm a great admirer of people like Stanley Yaki, who was a priest scientist, right? I mean, there's some priests who are bad scientists, and some scientists who are priest scientists who may be bad priests, but I like the idea, right? And the reality that some priests are in fact very good scientists, and I have to think that the perspective of being a priest, my hope is that it's something that actually both informs and tempers their study of science. Anyway, so I'm not unsympathetic to Dürer, and I also think in some ways too, because I'm a big fan of the Van Eyck brothers, who painted the Ghent altarpiece about 75 or 80 years before Dürer was in his prime, and they were painting with perspective that was learned from there being miniaturists, portrait painters. At least that was true of Jan van Eyck. And if you've ever seen the Ghent altarpiece, what's astonishing about it is how large it is and how amazing the detail is. in it, and it seems like something unprecedented that the Flemish primitives who followed them could not paint that well, and so there's something though they were able to isolate something, and yet if you know the Ghent altarpiece, it's sort of the biggest picture painting there is in terms of its account of salvation history, and its the depth of its depiction, the subtlety and depth of its depiction of the Christian narrative in a single 15 by 22 set of wooden panels. So I'm not this idea of human beings sort of doing intellectual pursuits that are fragmentary. I think that there's a kind of redemptive possibility in that, right? That you explore some aspect of truth so that in the hope that it can somehow be part of a more unified understanding of truth, which is also my feeling about the new urbanists, actually, if you want to know. I've been to Seaside many times. I love going there because I think because I think it's a beautiful place. But I also think that the people who made it, that they were trying to recover something, right? They were trying to recover something that was lost, and that they undertook it trying to contribute, in however halting a way, to some larger recovery of something that's been lost in the culture. In fact, actually, I won't identify who, but a very prominent member of the Congress for New Urbanism. I will say it's not my dean, my new dean, who was one of the founders of the CNU, but another prominent member said to me not long ago. He said, we were really naive to imagine that good design and good shopping would make good urbanism. I just found that a really interesting remark, that he would say that, because it's not that good design and good shopping are not components of good urbanism. It's that there's more to it. But I think that even in their kind of halting, fragmentary way, new urbanists are seeking that greater whole, and it sort of gives me it also, to some extent, it warms my heart a little bit toward the modernists who were seeking in their own kind of way to do that, and that so that I'm thinking that maybe there's even redemption, a kind of redemption for modernism as a kind of niche market aesthetic tradition, because I think in the end the things that are good that we sustain over time, really the only way that we can sustain them is as a tradition, which of course is part of what makes our current the current state of our culture and of architectural culture problematic, right? Because there's no interest in no understanding of modernism as a tradition, no understanding of the necessary of tradition as being a necessary element of human being, right? We're either traditionalists and know it, or we're traditionalists and don't know it. And if you don't know it, then you subject yourselves to all kinds of illusions. So the last thing that I'll say, really, and it's just kind of a question, has to do with education, right? Because David, when you talk about this experience of of glow and of a sense of the rightness of things in sort of smaller, everyday life, and how, one question that I have is how does one attain that, right? I think that what you're talking about is something true, but I think not everybody attains that sensibility, that those who are brought up with a sense of the sacramental character of reality have a bit of a head start, even if they don't understand it intellectually, that there's something in it that really shapes character. But then there's also this question of, there are, there's the experience of, having a kind of calm certitude and appreciation and gratitude for whatever circumstance that you're in, that allows you, at worst to bear it and at best to be grateful for it. But then there's another kind of experience where, you're just gobsmacked by some experience of the sacred. You get knocked off your horse, you go to Chartres and you convert, and so I guess, maybe the question that I have is what role does that kind of experience play in the ambitions, the legitimate ambitions of artists, not just architects, but any artists, and maybe all of us, to the extent that we're artisans of a sort. We decorate our houses. We try to arrange things in ways that seem pleasing. But the people who are the really great artists really have tapped into something, and they that has a profound effect on people. And of course that ambition can itself be very distorting, right, to the character of an artist. But again, there's a kind of a divine madness that God doesn't choose always the best people, right, to be the greatest artists. Anyway, so I'm wondering though, how in a world that, this is my last question, how in a world that is this postmodern, post-structuralist world of expressive individualism, where there is no confidence that we can know anything truly, or there's anything true to be known. What's the educational agenda, right, for something like that? Who's engaged in it? How do we organize those of us who see sermons in stones, right, and books in running brooks, and for whom all the world is a stage? How do we educate our students? How do we shape the communities that we're part of to, I think, learn the kinds of things that we need to learn to really be the kinds of creatures that we were meant to be? I want to say that your book has been and is enormously clarifying, and I thank you for it.
Thank you, Philip. So, first of all, I think with regard to education, I think that the things that we are talking about have to be modeled by great teachers, and rather than have it be in a reading or in a methodology. And I think one of the things that we've lost over the years is the apprentice system, where the young artist learns from the master by living in his community. And over the years of my teaching, even though of course we don't have that type of arrangement in modern education, over the years of my teaching, I know that the people that impacted me the most is not, I forgot what they told me, but it was the way that they modeled life that is meaningful. So I think these types of things we're talking about, again, one of my points was that it's not about teaching students only to do physical objects, but it is a way of life, to model a way of life. And we might be able to teach 30 students not 30 in a studio, but I mean 15 students in a studio to design physical things. We might be able to impact one of those students who sees something worthwhile in our life in terms of pattern and order and humility. And I think so it really is a small scale incremental education in that way, and not, I don't know how that would be mass produced. Yes, and I also applaud your point about perspective. I mean, my goal, as you know, was trying to trace the ideas and their impact, the genealogy of these ideas, not necessarily the problem of perspective. I mean, one of my courses I taught perspective drawing, and if my students in that class drew like early century drawing, I mean, they probably wouldn't pass the course. So yeah, there's all kinds of benefits to categorization and perspectival accuracy. I think the point is when those things become a substitute to connection with the transcendent, that's when we lose our guide wires. And I think that was my concern in unfolding the chapters of the book.
I should say, I can draw perspectives. My students can all draw perspectives wonderfully, but I can't.
Well, the problem these days is, the computer does everything, which means it doesn't go through you anymore. And I have a huge problem with that, but I'm dating myself. You just press a button and the perspective's there. Well, how did it get there? Nobody knows. And that is a different type of challenge that we have. My point is we're moving further and further away from modeling in life what knowledge should be.
Thank you both for lots of thought-provoking ideas. We would like to open things up for comments or questions. Let me just point out, we in our announcements have said that we were going to wrap up at 6:30. That's only 12 minutes from now, so we may stretch our response time if people are interested in doing that, and we can convince David and Philip to humor us a little bit further. But if you've got a question and you want to raise your hand, or you want to post a comment, we have a comment now on the chat. Jeremy Wang, go ahead. Why don't you, if you've got a question, go ahead.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Dr. Wang, for the presentation. I got a question. Your book obviously published in April of 2020, so obviously completed pre-pandemic, right? And I'm thinking about your slides in terms of I can't remember what it said, but trying to have sacrament in these places. I'm struck by your comment of needing to drive across the town to do your writing in the cafe. So place matters, and trying to recap these importance of these places matters. I think there's been a lot of ink, especially last spring, spilt over the death of the college campus, and there's not going to need to be in-person teaching anymore. Here on the East Coast, it's New York City's dead. There's going to be no more commercial real estate and blah 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 blah. And I think part of what we've seen in the last certainly the last fall semester, but otherwise, is sort of a rebuffing of this, and that these places, these campuses, these cities, there's a value in those places and people doing community and doing life in those places, right? So how do you reconcile for someone like me I haven't been to my office since on my university campus since March of last year. I have no expectation that I'm going to be back on my campus in that built environment until maybe next fall. And so there is my procession and arrival on a day-to-day basis is I get out of bed, I put jeans on, I get a cup of coffee, and then I walk 3 feet over to my desk where I'm at, right now, right? And so what, I guess in a pandemic world, what have we lost, and what do we need to not politically, but what do we need to sort of fight for and seek out in these? We've lost these ability to do our jobs, to meet in person, to do these things in these physical spaces, which I'm guessing you are positing have importance in and of themselves, is doing life in these physical spaces because of how they connect to us as a spiritual being.
Yes, the book was written pre-pandemic, and I think that this question is for all of us moving forward, because we have never faced, I haven't, a worldwide pandemic situation like the one we're in. So we're all learning. I do think that there are challenges to embodiment and in this type of situation where we can't go places, we can't process the places. On the other hand, I'm thoroughly blessed by so many people who are able to attend this thing, not the least yourself from Philadelphia, Professor Bess from Notre Dame. And so we're all learning as to what sacrament can mean in a Zoom world. And I'm very clear in saying that I don't have any sort of stock answers for that, and I like to learn with you and with everybody else. I will say that the general switch to cyber connectivity, I do a lot of writing about that. And all of architecture now is being rethunk. Is that a word? Because of cyber connectivity. And we're all in a learning process and finding out what's up ahead. I'd like to suggest that the principles that some of the principles I posited, like for example, this journey aspect to life, that doesn't go away. We're just going to have to find new ways of meaningful engagement for that in a virtual world.
David, there's a comment on the chat from Tony Clark. Great talk. I wonder, however, if it's appropriate to allow any space to be called sacrament. Churchill said, first we shape our spaces and then they shape us. He thought that environment can both improve and corrupt our natures. Your thoughts?
Amen to that. The Charles Taylor's concern about our built environment today, and my point that ordinary everyday places anchor our sense of belonging in the world or not. I think much of our built environment today lacks the sort of built-in proportional attributes that earlier centuries had in their classical architecture, in their architectural environments, precisely because we're still trying to handle, we're processing technology, we're processing industrial revolution, what the industrial revolution has brought. So vast tracts of our built environment works against sacramentality. Of course, that traffic jam example also says that sacramentality is not the material environment only, but the cultivation within us. Hi, Kyle.
Hello, first of all, thank you for a terrific book and lecture, and also Professor Best for your response. I had a question for Professor Wang, which is, what do you say personally to an architect who, in all good faith, says to you, the idea of rhyming orders makes perfect sense in, let's say, a pre-modern context. But let's imagine that architect, in all good faith, believes that the sort of order that can be identified in the world around us today has more to do with chaos theory, perhaps, than with the sorts of order that you might discover in Alberti, or that it's some kind of much more complex set of systems which we will never, which we're only beginning to understand, such that the sorts of orders that we need to extract are of an entirely different kind of register. So how do you begin to respond to that sort of architect?
Right, it would be a beginning of a conversation, and the way that I would approach it is as follows. In architecture today, in the discourse today, there are two big issues. One is the meta design, as you're talking about, these enormous buildings being built, many of them generated by computer-aided computation, looking like nothing we've ever seen in the world, on the one hand. On the other hand, there's a tremendous push for sustainable design. And so I find the two to be really interesting, because when you work with the sustainable design people, it's all about returning to locality. It's all about returning to the earth. It's all about small scale, sort of buying local. It's all about slow food. In other words, there's a way that that the sustainable design program, and I talk about this in chapter 5, could be a lesson for us in humility and in recognizing our smallness in contrast to the largeness of this world, of our natural environment. So I think that it would be a conversation with this architect. I think that we are now always going to be architecture that is sort of this new postmodernist genre, and that will be the predominant direction. But I think there's a clue for us within the sustainable design movements where it is a return back to green, it's a return back to locality, it's a return back to sense of place, it's a return back to organic cyclings of nature in and out. And I talk about how, from a resurrectional point of view, we see it in the seasons with the harvest every time. What you plant is nothing compared to the enormous yield that comes out. And I think these are, I think sustainability and this conversation is a way in to talk to those who promote that the orderliness that, for example, Alberti talked about is no longer germane.
Thank you.
Dr. Wang, I have a question. My name is Joe Mudd. I teach in the Department of Religious Studies at Gonzaga, and I teach courses in liturgy and sacraments. And one of the first things I do in my course on liturgy is we look at architecture, because it forms the context within which worship takes place and influences it to a profound degree. But one of the things that we deal with in that context is the development over time of church architecture and the contemporary period, where you now have this tension between sort of classical approaches and contemporary approaches. And so in relation to your fourth point, or your fourth way of getting to this view of church, of sacrament in architecture, the old is often better. And how do we bring the old with us and prevent that from just being revivalism? Because and Dr. Bess will know this, his colleagues at Notre Dame, like Duncan Stroik, they've been sort of inspirations of a new kind of revivalism of classical church architecture. But there are all these great gifts from modern church architecture. Not all of them are great. You know, Le Corbusier's Tourette Monastery is maybe not great. But Marcel Breuer's, I think, church at St. John's in Collegeville is a different kind of a space. So how do we take the best of the past, but also allow insights from modernity to speak to how we create spaces?
Yeah,
thank you for
question.
wonderful presentations, both.
Great question, and thank you for that, Joseph. And I love to hear what Professor Bess has to say about it. I take care in the book to talk about sacrament sort of quite separate from specific understandings of sacrament that, for example, the Catholic or the Church or the Reformed churches talk about, because the book is not about church architecture per se. But having said that, because I said that, I'm looking at sacramentum, as Professor Bess alluded to. It has a much older vintage where small me belonging to a large reality by this token and I have a sense of belonging. So I think my primary interest in the book was to talk about that for any kind of architecture. I will say for of course, there's all kinds of conversation about church architecture and sacramentality, and I have with me several books about bemoaning modernist architecture and what's happened to the church architecture. And my wife, Valerie, when we were in Helsinki, there was in the shopping mall, in the shopping square, there's this purely modernist cocoon made out of, I believe it was wood, and you enter it underneath and you're just bathed in this globe of light. And for her, that is the height of sacramentality without any traditional references. So let me just say, I don't think there's any one particular way. I think as an architect, we are all not in favor of a cookie cutter revivalism to bring Chartres. In fact, in my book on China, there's in the Wuhan area, district, one of the districts in Wuhan, by the way, that's where the virus, never mind. There's an entire Gothic cathedral rebuilt as a wedding chapel. And it's just atrocious, right? So I'm not for any revivalism or copy stage setting in that way. But sacramentality in a larger, broader sense I think it's possible and it's elusive, but it's everyday and it transcends church spaces. Philip, do you want to say anything about Duncan or and that approach to?
Well, I'll say that I think that Duncan is without question the foremost classical church architect of his time. But I think what I'd like to say, though, generally is about what it means to be a classical architect. And I say this as one who's not a classical architect, or not even really an architect. I profess, right? So, but it has to do with participating in tradition. I mean, one of the merits of classicism is that it is a rational and systematic and long tradition of making buildings. And we talk about chess players, right? We talk about musicians, participants in a sport, something like that. Well, people have been doing classical architecture for a long time, and one of the things that one of my, not Duncan, but one of my other colleagues who's a committed classicist makes the point, and I'm convinced that he's correct, is that one of the good things about a classical education in architecture is that it makes it hard even for mediocre designers to do bad buildings, and it gives a lot of space for good designers to do great buildings. And I find, I don't know, David, you mentioned Alistair McIntyre. I find one of the most sort of pregnant passages that I've read, in Alistair's work to be something that he says in Three Rival Versions of Moral Inquiry, where he's talking about encyclopedia as Enlightenment rationality, and genealogy, talking about Nietzsche, and tradition, talking about Aquinas. And he talks about the mode of rationality in each of those, and that the mode of rationality in a tradition, right, has to do with engaging the tradition, in some way submitting yourself to it as a novice, making its story part of your own story. And then he says something really interesting. He says, what it means to be a master in a tradition is to be able to look to the past and understand how that can inform the needs of the present extended into the future. And he makes the point that it's really, as an artistic tradition, or he's not even talking about artistic traditions, he's talking about a healthy tradition, is that it's something that inherently looks both ways. It looks back and it looks forward. And so, I think that, so I'm not a classicist, but I wish Notre Dame in some ways was more classicist than it is, at least in our sort of profession of what we teach. I regard learning classical architecture as being exactly like being educated in the classics as a, in an undergraduate education, in which classics are the, are the foundation of the education. It means you can do anything, right? I mean, really, I mean, it sort of teaches you how to think about things, and it's not. I mean, arguably the best traditions or the best period of American architecture, classical or otherwise, was this period of about 1880 to 1940, when the City Beautiful movement, in which architects were doing things in all manner of idioms. What was the plural of idiom? Idioms, and it was all good. It's like there were no bad buildings that were being built. Even the modern buildings were really good. But part of it had to do with that they came out of a system where they were all educated either at the École des Beaux-Arts, or they apprenticed in offices where the principals had associations with the École. And again, I have colleagues who say that standard is not good enough. We need to go back to the best, right? Which which the École des Beaux-Arts is not. But the École des Beaux-Arts as an education for contemporary architects, we would get better architecture if we were educated that way. And anyway, I think that one of the problems, I think, with modernism as an aesthetic, because modernism is an ideology. Nobody, not even a modernist, believes in modernist ideology, but they undertake it as a practice, as an aesthetic thing, and it is an aesthetic tradition. I don't see how you can deny it, and I don't. The only reason I think that a modernist would deny it is for ideological reasons. But my education in architecture school was I was being educated into a tradition of modernism, and it it had its authoritative references and all of those things. And so we can't escape that tradition. But it's not just participating in tradition is not just looking backward. It's also looking forward. And so that's why I say I think that if there's a future for modernism, and my lingering objections, or maybe they're fixed objections, I don't know, to modernism really have to do with the premise, its material premises, and their literal environmental sustainability. But as a kind of a niche market that's an aesthetic tradition. I mean, I'm from Chicago, right? So I mean, I think it would be tragic if Chicago, in some way, just lost its sense of being a place where modernist architecture was a real living tradition. I just think it can't be the default position, both because for environmental reasons, but also because it's not systematic enough to prevent maybe 80% of the buildings to be just not very good buildings.
Dr. Wang, I'm sure you're probably aware of the book by John Summerson called The Classical Language of Architecture. Yeah. He makes that argument that Professor Best just made. The system of classical design makes mediocre architects better and better architects great. It is a system, and in that regard, it would not be copying to continue the classical tradition. I mean, we still want our banks to be done in the Doric order because the masculinity of it protects our assets, that kind of thing.
There's another question on the chat from Sue Lanny Madsen. The Churchill quote is a favorite of mine. We shape our buildings shape us, but a corollary occurs to me on listening to conversation. Our buildings also reflect us. Where is our attention focused? Is there order or chaos? So her question is, assuming there is sacramental space and chaos, what is the sacred at its heart, if not logos?
Gosh, you need a philosopher to unpack that one. Open to what is the logos in what'd she say? This is my co-author, by the way. What did she say?
What is the sacred at its heart, if not logos?
Well, yeah, I mean, in the book, I say that we human beings we're programmed for sacrament, for meaning beyond the material. And in midst of architecture that does not conform to a great tradition model that I showed, there is what I say, there's a vestigial sacramentality going on in there. Because we simply must identify with something big and find our place in it. So so I think well, Solani, are you here? I mean, I guess I need to have a conversation before I can answer that further.
Anyone else have a question or a comment? As a philosopher rather than an artist, I was thinking about something in connection with your comment about sort of the dead copying that we find with revivalism. And I was trying to think about how does that relate to the everyday, and that maybe this is a weird way to connect A and B here, but it made me think of the fact that for most ordinary people, the art in their immediate environment is what many artists would call kitsch, right? It's copies of you mentioned the Eiffel Tower, right? It's a little statue of the Eiffel Tower. Joe's pointing to the print on his wall behind him, right? It's copies of art, or it's even sometimes prints that are copies of art. And I'm curious what you think about. So what is, for an ordinary person, if I think about the comments that you've made, especially thinking about the traffic jam, it's finding the sacramental in the everyday rather than surrounding yourself with objects that communicate sacramentally. Is that right? Am I hearing what you're saying?
Well, certainly the first part is finding sacramentality in everyday places. I'm certainly not against having icons or other sort of objects of religious devotion. I mean, that certainly when I'm promoting the book does not exclude that.
I'm thinking, I guess, more about the kinds of art that are accessible to people.
Right.
Actually, my train of thoughts here probably was spurred initially by your reference to the Truman Show, the film, and that reminded me of especially when you were talking about light, the work of Terrence Malick, who is very much someone who tries to exploit natural light in films. But I don't know. I mean, what are artistic works that we surround ourselves with, or that we put in our environment that increase the likelihood that we'll have a sacramental experience?
So again, I mean, the difficulty with this sacrament in everyday places, much of it requires internal cultivation in line with what we perceive to be larger orders. That the physicality of the object, even though, as I said, we need the physical token. If it were just a physical token, that's not going to cause us to have a sacramental experience without the other two pieces. With respect to your comment about reproduction, reproduced art, you know, some of us are familiar with that seminal essay by Benjamin, The Work of Art in an Age of Reproduction. Once we are able to reproduce things, I mean, the cookie cutter reproduce things, I mean, we have ourselves a problem. I mean, it's you know, even a Mercedes-Benz. What is the original Mercedes-Benz? There is no original Mercedes-Benz because everything is a cookie cutter thing. And so now we live in a world of mechanical reproduction. And again, so the physical object actually in many cases presents a problem. You know, I can't go to the Eiffel Tower, so I go to Las Vegas. I mean, I think they have a reproduction, a half-scale reproduction of this thing. This is just of course, it's our culture, and we enjoy it in other ways. But as far as sacramentality goes and reproduced things, and I'm talking about Tudor houses with the, you know, with the gables and the 2x4s painted brown that you paste onto the gable. I mean, what can I say? You know, the object itself does not promise sacramentality, original or copy, I would say, but it's the cultivation within us.
Can I speak to this?
Please.
So, David, what if the veneration of icons
Yes.
actually a kind of, if it's not a necessary precursor to sacramental sensibility, you know, what if it's nevertheless an important thing to help one develop that sense? And
Right.
I think that, I mean, what makes me think about this is, again, there's a wonderful little book, and you probably know it, by Yaroslav Pelikan, called The Vindication of Tradition. It was a series of Jefferson lectures, I think 4 lectures, and the heart of the book is the 3rd chapter, which is actually the chapter is titled The Vindication of Tradition, and he talks about, and Pelikan's interesting because he was a Lutheran, and then he reverted to Orthodoxy. And so one of the things, I don't know much about Orthodoxy, but my understanding of Orthodoxy with respect to icons is that they don't seek originality in the icon. That it's actually a matter of faithfully depicting the image in a way that is consistent with the way that the image has always been depicted. And I mean, it's a really kind of interesting thing in the West, right? Because we look for artistic creativity, and we have these great artists who sort of put their own stamp, which I'm perfectly willing to say it's a divine stamp, right? That's unique to works of art, but that's not the Orthodox sensibility. And you also kind of see it in the architecture as well, that Orthodox churches are more consistently uniform in their design than what Catholic churches or Protestant churches are. So Pelikan makes this really interesting distinction about tradition. He talks about tradition as an idol, tradition as a token, and tradition as an icon. And what he means by tradition as an icon, I think, is what you mean by sacrament. I think that's an intuition, but it has to do with the icon. It's not something that's discarded when you get to where you're going. It's actually part of getting there, right? It participates in where you're trying to get. So I don't know. I just think that, and I'm not any kind of an artist, but it's a really interesting, I think, take on artistic creativity and what seems to be intuitively to be maybe part of the discipline, right? Part of the spiritual furniture of one's life that allows you at a certain point to actually see, the grace of of being in pilgrimage in a traffic jam.
Well, thank you for that. And the only thing I'll say with respect to icons, when the book was being produced, we had a sacramentalist group who came to my house to read the drafts of the chapters. I cook up something Chinese, and we have dinner, simple dinner, and we talk about drafts of the chapters, and many of them are my Orthodox friends. Yeah. So, in fact, Robin Phillips is right here, if you're there, Robin. And I would say that my respect for, and you know this, Philip, my respect for Catholic practice and the Orthodox traditions exponentially have increased. since taking on this book project. Other than that, I'm not sure I'm prepared to comment specifically on iconography as the Orthodox understands it with respect to the things that I've written.
Yeah, I'm.
Well, we've gone a bit past our planned quitting time. I appreciate the willingness of both our speaker and respondent to carry on a conversation. And yes, we would like to thank them. We can't hear a round of applause thanks to technology, but I sure want to say thank you. And I want to remind you folks that David shared with us a discount code. I think it was RL something, wasn't it, David? It'll be on the recording, by the way.
Okay.
So I will post the recording probably within 3, 4. Okay, someone has it. Valerie, you have.
FLR40.
Oh,
F is in Frank, L is in Lucy, R40.
There we go. Thank you. I shouldn't have tried to do it from memory, but yes. If you, I will say, I'll put a plug in here for the Socratic Club, even for folks that find themselves geographically far away. You can find us pretty easily just by doing a Google search, Gonzaga Socratic Club. There's a lot of video from the last 15 years or so of speakers, and you might find a thing or two that's interesting. There's a way to subscribe too if you want to stay in touch. Thank you everyone for coming. I sure appreciate it. I know our speaker and respondent both appreciate such a great audience.
Yes.
Good questions. Thanks a bunch. Have a good evening.
And thanks to you, David. Thanks to all.
Thank
Thanks.
you, David.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
David.
Thank you, Philip. Bye-bye.